Welcome to the chosen ones. Never interrupt your opponent while they are making a mistake. Simply hand them the pen and let them sign their demise. They believed they'd cornered you. They whispered. They strategized. They thought they were clever, strategizing in group conversations as if you weren't 3 steps ahead with receipts, timestamps, and an alibi. So tidy, it could handle your taxes. But here's the cold, harsh reality. People who grin in your face and applaud while you're not looking are responsible for a significant portion of betrayal. And the rest of them are simply upset. You saw through the fog and did not welcome them inside the royal chamber. See, most people react with fury. You replied strategically. You let them construct the stage and then take the floor out on opening night. All that false love, you saved it as an archive. All this jealousy, you studied it, then reversed the script and delivered it back with such lyrical flair that Shakespeare would have dropped a gangster tear. So buckle in, because this is not about petty vengeance. This is chess in a burning room. You didn't just survive their scheme. You made it. Your promotional trailer, number 1. You didn't flinch because genuine ones are calculating chaos. They do not respond to it. You didn't flinch because genuine ones are calculating chaos. They do not respond to it. When you saw the jealousy sneaking in, you didn't throw a fit or cause a scene. You paused. You observed. You remained mute. Not because you were terrified, but because you were scanning the area. Most individuals get noisy when they believe they have been assaulted. You received surgery. You slowed time in your thoughts, analyzed the energy shift, and saw how each phony grin twitched just a bit too late. They expected you to panic. They anticipated a big reaction, a noisy clash that they could use into their story. But you were too experienced for it. You understand how emotional responses give up power, and you don't engage in such games. You observed the room's temperature, took note of every unusual movement, and made them believe they had control. That is what made the strike so clean when it arrived. No theatrics, just accuracy. The fact is that chaos is noisy, chaotic, and distracting, but only to those who have never learned to stay still in the midst of it. You saw the chaos for what it really was, a blueprint. Every jab, odd feeling, each dubious action. It was not arbitrary. It was data, and you got it without anyone ever knowing. That is the benefit of being calm. It renders you invisible to those who are too loud to recognize their own exposure. You were never just enduring that drama. You were charting it as they were attempting to shake you. You were becoming more alert, aware, and dangerous. And when it was time to reply, you didn't just react. You produced something they couldn't even attribute to you since it was too tidy and controlled to develop. That's what occurs when a person doesn't just confront turmoil. They calculated it, which is why they didn't see it coming. Number 2, they assumed they were speaking behind your back. You were documenting the echo. They assumed they were speaking behind your back. You were documenting the echo. They really felt they were being slick, with whispered discussions, stealthy shadow, and the type of energy that people feel allows them to conceal. Fake chuckles and ambiguous posts. What they didn't comprehend was that nothing can genuinely be concealed from someone who has been forced to acquire instinct. You weren't just guessing. You were detecting trends, accumulating errors, and connecting dots in real time. You allowed them to discuss, conspire, and feel they could get away with it. However, you were 5 steps ahead, hoarding receipts like trophies. People like that consistently underestimate those who listen more than they talk. They believe that silent equals ignorant. What they didn't consider was that you'd seen this before. You've dealt with jealousy, disguised as friendliness. You've coped with the laughter that fades as you leave the room. Instead of addressing them straight away, you took a more strategic approach. You let it grow. You let them show you their whole hand while they believed you were still learning the game. And it wasn't just what they said. It was how they stated it. How their tone altered when others were there. How their support came as a backhanded compliment. You saw it everything. You didn't have to infer reasons when the patterns were obvious enough to document. You didn't need to expose them since the truth was already expressing itself via their actions. You knew if you waited long enough, they'd dig their own pit and proudly utter your name. That is the part they will never grasp. You did not strike out of nowhere. Simply let the echo get loud enough for everyone else to hear. Because when people gossip behind your back, They forget you have years and, in some cases, a better recall than them. So, when you moved, it seemed easy. But each step was contextual. Every stillness had a purpose. You didn't just hear the murmurs. You ensured they left a trail. Number 3, you did not match their intensity. You redirected it, like a black hole. You did not equal their energy. Instead, you diverted it like a black hole when they came at you with hostility. You did not strike back or descend to their level. You took it everything. Envy, attitude, and shadow. You accepted that without flinching. Not because you were weak, but because you realized something. They never will. Power is not always loud. The true power is understanding you don't have to answer to every gun fired. Sometimes the greatest move is to wait until the moment is right before moving. They wanted a response. They wanted you off balance. Angry. Defensive. That was the aim. That is how they win. By pulling others into their mental quagmire. But you didn't contribute to it. You channeled all of that energy and commotion into your concentration. You used it as fuel while they were obsessed with you. You were leveling up in quiet. They didn't expect you to utilize their hatred as motivation, which took them off surprise. They tried to distract you, but instead energized you. You moved smartly, not fast. You looked around the room as they competed for their attention. You diverted the energy like a natural force that they couldn't understand or control. Everything they hurled at you ended up working to your advantage. Their chatter made you even more unshakable. That uncertainty drove you to improve your skill. Every effort to tear you down just made you more precise. This is what it means to divert energy. You do not give them the joy of knowing they reached you. You utterly changed the narrative, leaving them wondering whether they ever mattered at all. By the time they understood what had occurred, it was too late. You were no longer in the same place. Mental, emotional, and spiritual. You did not match their mess. You upgraded from it while they were being loud and petty. You transformed their fury into fuel and went away. Untouchable. Number 4, they mistook your silence for ignorance. But you were creating an arsenal, not alibis. They misunderstood your quiet for cluelessness. But you were creating an arsenal, not alibis. While they planned, you prepared. There is a distinction between being quiet and inactive. They assumed you were in the dark just because you didn't speak up to them. Silence indicated weakness and bewilderment and even dread. They didn't know, however, that some of the most deadly movements are carried out discreetly. You weren't sitting still because you weren't sure what was going on. You sat still because you did. You saw through the shadow, read between the lines, and knew precisely what game they were playing. But rather than addressing them when they anticipated it, you did something unexpected. You began accumulating power as they plotted behind the scenes. You were improving your mentality, strategy, and position. You weren't making excuses for yourself or going about trying to change storylines. You were honing your talents, reinforcing your limits, and getting ready for an unexpected time. That is the issue with folks who believe quiet signifies acquiescence. They forget that true strategy does not declare itself. You were not attempting to seem powerful. You were becoming stronger. You did not have to defend your name in every chat or respond to every passive hostile comment. You were letting them speak, allowing them to slip up, allowing them to expose their cards while you strategize your next move. Every slur, every phony grin, every underhanded remark. They were pouring gasoline to something much greater than vengeance. You weren't creating excuses. You were developing evidence, growth, and leverage. They had no notion your quiet was not stillness. It was structure. They underestimated the storm since you did not report the thunder. They did not notice the preparation, planning, or patience. But when the time arrived, everything happened as if it were written. Your quiet did not indicate that you were behind. It indicated you were calculating each move, waiting for the right moment to attack. Not for attention, but for influence. They made noise. You produced results. And by the time they discovered you were never dumb, but rather calculated, it was too late to pivot. You were not dormant. You were dangerous, quiet, strategic. Fully. You made them believe they were ahead. I then reworked the script using them as extras. The trap was so exquisite that they agreed to walk into it. They believed they had the upper hand. That sneer, that false assurance. They really felt they were outwitting you. They misunderstood your serenity for being one step behind, unaware that you were the one holding the pen the whole time. You gave them just enough room to feel like they had won. Allow them to cast shadow, talk smooth, move shady, and pretend you have no idea. What they didn't comprehend was that you had already done the arithmetic, simulated the consequences, and placed each piece just where you wanted it. You let them play the major character in a screenplay that they had no idea you created. That is how tidy your plan was. While they were acting for attention, you were in charge of the whole production. You were not responding. You were setting the scenario. Every pause, delicate movement, every act of constraint was part of a larger image. They never had the distance to see. They did not fall into a trap because they were foolish. They strolled in because you led them to feel they were clever. You used their ego against them. You made their pride work for you. When they glanced up to celebrate their victory, the curtain had already closed on them. You turned the story so smoothly that they didn't notice when the roles changed. What they believed was control was in fact a set. What they believed was triumph was really your bait. You were not attempting to prove anything. You were only waiting for the proper opportunity to remind them who the true creator of the narrative was. And when you turned the last page, they were no longer in power. They were only background noise in your story twist. The best part was that you didn't have to brag. The elegance lay in the execution. They gave you the victory while believing it was theirs. That is not simply vengeance. That is mastery. Number 5. You made them believe they were ahead, then rewrote the screenplay with them as extras. You made them believe they were ahead, then rewrote the screenplay with them as extras. The trap was so exquisite that they offered to walk into it. That was the brilliance they didn't see coming. You did not have to scream, holler, assert, or outshine. You give them the limelight for the moment, creating the appearance of control. You allowed them to chat, scheme, and underestimate. Because you understood the long game and played it with surgical precision. They were confident they were in the lead. You were already behind the scenes scripting the whole story. Not with ego, but with accuracy. They believed they had the key role. They didn't comprehend the narrative was not about them. You did not combat their ego. You used it. Allow them to feel superior. Let them believe they had the upper hand. Everything was part of the design. Because redirection may be a more effective tactic than confrontation. You let them create their illusion and even aided them along the way. And just when they believed they'd won, you reversed the script. And that's the bit that truly hurt. It wasn't a lack of force. They caused their own downfall. The trap was not cruel. It was stunning, flawless, and too smooth to notice how you made it seem easy. Not because it was simple, but because you had practiced every motion before the first scene started. The breakdown was not due to sabotage. It was self-inflicted, curated by their hubris, guided by your insight. You never needed to show your intelligence. You just let the tale grow and allowed them just enough leeway to choose their own finale. You had already moved on to the next chapter when the truth became apparent. Unconcerned and ahead. That's the skill of playing the underappreciated part until it's time to admit you were the author all along. Number 6. Your vision was too high frequency. They suffocated from the height. Your vision was too high frequency. They suffocated from the height. You anticipated that since you work in a bandwidth, they are unable to tune in. You weren't too theatrical. You were not overthinking. You were merely seeing what others couldn't. And it made you a danger before you ever spoke. The fact is that some individuals are so engrossed in little matters that they cannot grasp someone who moves with purpose, pattern, and accuracy. They're locked in a loop. You are working in layers. They attempted to play checkers on a board that you had previously folded and left behind. You didn't merely detect jealousy. While they were observing surface-level wins, you were reading the undercurrents. They believed they could mask their envy under grins and sarcasm. But your intuition does not need evidence to know. It just knows. That explains why you were always 10 steps ahead. You were picking up signals. They weren't even aware they were transmitting. And when you did not reply as they anticipated, they were upset because others who cannot match your frequency usually feel you are being unreasonable. But you were not being tough. You were being purposeful. You stopped describing your movements because you understood they weren't designed to grasp them. You were not perplexing. They were not competent to decipher you. It was not arrogance. It was clarity. They were suffocating from the same air. You were prospering. And not because you are superior, but because you prioritized height above attention. You advanced, developed, and did not beg for acclaim. You've just relocated. That is what made it so terrifying. You did not need their approval. You had outgrown their comprehension. They did not revert because you changed. They fell back because they were unable to breathe where you were going. You were expressing vision. They were stuck on loudness. You were calculating the purpose. They were pursuing performance. And when they attempted to play you, they couldn't even understand the rules since the game was not built for their skill level. You did not lose them. You left them behind silently and shamelessly. Because altitude isn't for everyone, and you weren't designed to remain on the earth. Number 7. You've perfected the art of strategic invisibility. You have mastered the technique of strategic invisibility. Disappearance isn't a weakness. It's battlefield camouflage. You were not gone. You were blocking out the hubbub to concentrate on the task. People believed you were silent because you had nothing to say. The truth is, you had too much on your mind to squander on empty rooms. You took a step back, not to escape the combat, but to see it from the shadows. That was what threw them off. They were unable to track. You were unable to forecast. You couldn't label yourself. You become illegible on purpose. See, noisy players are targeted. Visible dangers are neutralized. That was something you learned early on. So, while others were performing, you were polishing. You detached yourself from useless circles and used quiet as a barrier while others pursued visibility. You created value every time they believed you were gone. You were really shifting, reorganizing, and reloading. You were not concealing. You were growing in private. The most dangerous individuals are not the loudest in the room. They are the ones you neglect to watch. You understood. You accepted not being noticed in order to resurface when it was most important. Sharper, stronger, 10 steps ahead. They were looking for noise. But you moved strategically, and you didn't return for attention. It was for impact. That's the thing with strategic invisibility. It is not about fear. It's all about control. You choose when to be seen. You choose when to talk. You choose when to attack. They misinterpreted your quiet as surrender, but it was merely your decision not to spend ammunition on a target who had not earned the shot. You were never absent. You were just above the bullshit. Let them believe you have vanished. Allow them to assume you faded. Because when you return, you won't stroll in and ask for a seat. You take the whole table. Not because they recognized you, but because you never stopped working while they were watching. And it is something they will never comprehend. Presence is powerful, but controlled absence is war. Number 8. They desired influence. You desired consequences. They want clout. You desired consequences. That is why your vengeance was quiet. It was a legacy. They were chasing moments. You were creating something that would withstand the cacophony. While they were busy performing, publishing, and asking for feedback, you were creating results that did not need an audience. That's the difference between folks who want to be noticed and those who want to change the atmosphere. They came for your name. You came for the whole story. They felt casting shade at your name would make them more relevant. They had no idea they were setting off a chain reaction considerably more serious than a little squabble. You were not applauding back. You were building. You were not seeking for followers. You were laying bricks, one step at a time, for a building they could never enter. They wanted screenshots. You wanted results. And the outcomes speak louder than any fleeting hoopla. You didn't have to convey your side of the story since your work did it for you. Your wins did the talking. Your progress revealed the jealousy. Your quiet made them louder, which made them sloppy. That's what happens when one person focuses on appearances while the other works on permanency. They received external validation. Yours was rooted. They needed applause. You needed time. And when your time arrived, it did not erupt. It spread silently, aggressively, and without fanfare. Your vengeance wasn't bringing them down. It was so far above them that they couldn't understand what occurred. They sought attention. You became an example, and it struck harder than any retort could. You didn't just outgrow them. You rendered them unimportant by being memorable. Your goal was never to prove them incorrect. It was about being so correct, solid, and irrefutable that history would speak for you. They sought clout to feel important for the day. You picked consequences so that your presence would be remembered for years. That is not vengeance. That is evolution. That is legacy. Number 9. You did not clap back. You diverted their karma with precision. You did not clap back. You redirected their karma with GPS precision. They wanted a response. You provided them a result. They expected drama, a tantrum, and petty back and forth. They may make a screen recording and then play the victim card. But you did not offer them any of it. You avoided the bait because you spotted the trap. They were attempting to cause turmoil so that you would seem to be the issue, but you approached the situation differently. You let their energy to collapse in on itself. Instead of descending to their level, you reroute the flow. You did not shout, post, or rage. You've just relocated. Different, smarter and colder, sharper. They came to get your attention. You gave them stillness and strategy. And the hush, it had waited and toyed with them. They assumed you were ignoring them. You were not. You were monitoring everything and deciding not to react in ways they could foresee or control. You let life do the hard lifting. You realized that every action they took out of malice was another seed sown for their demise, not yours. You didn't need vengeance. You allow their activity to loop back to them in a package. They enveloped themselves. You set the locations, and karma arrived at their door with their own terrible intentions. That's the thing. They were seeking attention. You were creating outcomes. You transformed their petty assaults into momentum. While they were making fuss, you turned every insult into an opportunity for advancement. You were making modifications. And by the time they noticed you weren't applauding back, you had won. They were struck speechless as they saw you shine. Your accomplishment was more than just the flex. It was the concert. They didn't see the answer coming because they were too concentrated on the present while you planned the aftermath. That is the power of not responding. You allow karma to be timely and exact. They wanted a wall. You handed them a mirror. And what better way to get even than to make them absolutely irrelevant quietly and without the need for praise? Simply indisputable effects. Number 10. They examined your movements. You investigated their motives. They examined your movements. You investigated their motives. Skill is apparent. Motive lies in the shadows. You pursued the latter. They observed everything you did, as if it were a blueprint, mimicking your words, style, and cadence. They assumed that if they reproduced the outside, they would be able to capture the center. But they didn't comprehend you weren't following tricks or trends. You were going with purpose. And while they were fixated on what you were doing, you were fixated on why they were paying so close attention in the first place. That is the true game. Knowing the reason for someone's smile, praises, and unexpected support. Because jealousy seldom makes a big entrance. It enters in a pleasant manner. You were already aware of this. You were not deceived by who was applauding. You were seeing who halted before they did, as they studied your method. You would interpret their motivation, energy, and desire to keep track. It was not admiration. It was a measurement. They were not inspired. They were threatened. But you did not panic. You did not force them out. You made them believe they had access. You allowed them to remain, watch, and gather. And while they were busy monitoring your steps, you were keeping notice of their patterns, discrepancies, and occasions when their words did not match their enthusiasm. You weren't after their regard. You were examining their plan. And when you saw through it, the game was done. Because ability is simple to replicate, but purpose is hidden until you know where to look. And you were taught to peek underneath the surface. You weren't afraid about anyone observing your movements. You were looking into what made them watch in the first place. Was it curiosity, insecurity, or competition? You clocked it all. So when it was time to move, you didn't just block them. You outclassed them. They were following your footsteps. But you'd already plotted their purpose and blazed the trail behind you. They were playing checklists. You were reading souls. That is not paranoia. That is precision. And that's why they missed your next move. Because, while they were watching your hands, you were watching their hearts. A number. You outplayed them with a single weapon. They never developed self-discipline. You outplayed them with a single weapon. They never developed self-discipline. Envy is loud. Mastery is quiet. One unravels, while the other lasts. They moved impulsively. You moved with purpose. That was the gap. They were never able to shut. They let their emotions control their speech and their ego control their actions. You practiced something they couldn't pretend to control. You did not need to respond to everything expressed about you. You did not need to protect yourself in each room. You understood something that others didn't. Power does not panic. They were frantic to be seen, heard, and correct. They repeatedly exposed themselves. Loud insults, messy conflict, and risky moves. That was not strategy. That was insecurity with the microphone. But you did not feed it. You did not match the noise. You prepared yourselves to soar beyond it, even when you had every reason to fight back. That is not weakness. That's war-level patience. Self-discipline made you unpredictable. They expected you to react strongly, but you remained calm. And it made you dangerous. You didn't need to clap back because you were too busy making something they couldn't remove. You didn't have to publicize your every step since your consistency did the talking for you. They misunderstood your control for tenderness. That shows how little they understood power. You were not holding back because you were unable to strike. You held back because you didn't have to. You did not come to prove a point. You came to be the point. And you accomplished it without theatrics, as their jealousy consumed them from inside. You were mastering the things that truly mattered: timing, attention, and endurance. You constructed in quiet, developed in silence, and carried out in silence. When they discovered they couldn't shake you, they were already behind. Envy collapses under pressure. Mastery creates pressure. This is why they will burn out. And you will keep turning up. Not because you are louder, but because you are grounded. Self-discipline isn't only about avoiding chaos. It consistently outlasts it. A number. They were motivated by animosity. You were motivated by a premonition. They were motivated by animosity. You were motivated by a premonition. You were not paranoid. You were prepared. That is why they slipped onto your radar. They assumed you were simply being careful, maybe even excessively sensitive. However, you were not responding to what was occurring. You sensed what was going to happen. While others allowed resentment drive them into dangerous behavior, you remained anchored in clarity. You did not guess. You knew not because you heard a story, but because your intuition detected changes before anybody else did. You did not require evidence to prepare. You could see the fissures in the energy before the fallout occurred. Resentment caused them to be sloppy. You had surgery due to a premonition. They moved on from previous disappointments, attempting to wound you from a position of their own pain. However, you were already 5 steps ahead, not out of fear, but because you were overlying. You could feel their jealousy creeping in long before their comments became frigid. You can detect the change in their tone, the forced laughter, and the mounting tension they believed they were disguising. But you did not panic. You planned while others acted on emotion, and you moved with precision. They reacted rashly. You remained motionless and studied. That is what made the difference. You did not accept the bait. You saw them spiral into just what you predicted. That is not luck. That is vision. Premonition isn't some magical concept. It is pattern recognition, resulted from surviving. And you've had to survive more than people realize. So when the time came, you weren't shocked. You weren't astonished. You were ready. You knew exactly where they'd go, what they'd attempt, and how far they'd go. Because those motivated by bitterness are predictable. Their hate dictates their writing. You read it like a map. You did not retaliate. You did not warn them. You allowed them to write about the insight you silently possessed. Because when you are based on wisdom rather than scars, you do not move emotionally. You move just when it's appropriate. And that is why they lost the game. They believed they were playing alone, but they were motivated by malice. You were moved by instinct. Instinct always prevails. A number. You didn't need vengeance. You were the storm that they said would never arrive. You didn't need vengeance. You were the storm that they said would never arrive. You did not return the energy. You assimilated it and progressed beyond them. They expected you to crumble under strain, lash out, or become bitter like them. They expected their sabotage, silence, and shadow to derail you. But you delivered the opposite result. You grew. You did not replicate their movements. You digested every insult, phony grin, and obstructed door. You converted it into gasoline quietly, effectively, and strategically. While they were attempting to distract you, you were changing. Not out of spite, but out of need. You knew answering would just make you appear like them, and you weren't attempting to equal their level. You were creating a whole new one. They played emotional games, trying to elicit a response. You elevated them. Instead, they were searching for a scenario. You left them a legacy. That is the part they will never recover from. Not that you fought back, but that you didn't need to. You developed beyond your surroundings. They attempted to trap you inside. You allowed them to preserve their vigor. You didn't match their pandemonium, because you were too busy changing into something they couldn't identify. You did not show up with a vengeance. You showed up transformed. You embodied everything they stated. You would not. And then more, not to establish a point, but to show what occurs when you choose growth above games. They attempted to write you off, but you changed the ending, and now they're stuck watching the version of you they never thought could exist. The storm was not an eruption. It was your arrival, collected, focused, and developed. They never saw it coming because they were too preoccupied with underestimating the stillness, misinterpreting your serenity, and dismissing your resilience. You didn't need to clap back, provide receipts, or seek approval. You just became unmistakable. And it is the storm, not devastation. Ascension, the sort that drowns out all the fakes and leaves just the genuine ones remaining. You did not become their karma. You became their reminder. A number. They believed you were a checker. You were at the D quantum level in chess. They believed you were a checker. You were for the quantum level of chess. They drew straight lines. You curled the board as they moved. Predictably, one step leads to the next. You were playing many games at once in dimensions they couldn't understand. They were caught in linear thinking, focusing on quick gains and little victories while you were arranging a reality that twisted and bent beyond their understanding. Their plan was basic, flat, and inconspicuous. Yours was multifaceted, intricate, and undetectable until it was too late. They misjudged the depth of your intellect. They believed that if they controlled the obvious movements, they would have complete control of the game. But you were not just responding to what was in front of you. You were changing the rules, forging new paths, and folding the board to your advantage. You played on a plane where their pieces and tactics were outmoded, and they planned in black and white. You worked with countless shades of potential. They saw hurdles. You spotted opportunities concealed, veiled, and ready to be seized. They attempted to trap you using predictable patterns. You destroy such patterns before they develop. Their linear graphs were no match for your three-dimensional vision. They misunderstood your stillness for simplicity. Little did they know. Every silent motion was a measured step on a sophisticated map that only you had. You didn't just see the following move. You saw what happened after that, and the one after that, weaving futures they were still unable to imagine. And that's why they fell into traps they had no idea were prepared. Your skill was not in responding quickly. It was about thinking deeper while remaining on the surface. You sunk into the depths where true power plays take place. They attempted to play you on their board, but you didn't just alter the game. You modified the game's dimensions. In a checker universe, you played quantum chess. They attempted to capture you in straight lines, but you bent the whole board around them. And when they recognized it, the game had already over before it ever started. Finally, being the chosen one in a world full of jealousy and superficial games isn't about making a display. It is about something far deeper. It's about seeing what others don't see, moving where others are stopped, and constructing where others are breaking. While they sought clouds, you pursued consequences while they nurtured anger. You relied on foresight and accuracy. Yours were unstoppable because they were founded on discipline and vision. You did not just play their game. You curled the board, acting at levels they couldn't comprehend. Rewrite the rules softly, boldly, and irreversibly. Your legacy is not based on petty vengeance or transient adulation. It is designed with purposeful aim to have a long-lasting influence. The storms they dreaded were not sudden outbursts. They represented your ascent. You didn't need to respond or explain yourself since your outcomes shouted louder than words ever could. You become the quiet force that outlasts the noise, the peace inside the commotion, and the unseen hand guiding the future while they stay locked in the past. Being the chosen one is not something everyone understands. It is to get beyond the necessity for understanding entirely. It is to remain steadfast in your goal, knowing that those who envy will constantly follow shadows while you continue to create light. It is to accept the discipline that outlasts jealousy, the intelligence that predicts movements before they are made, and the strength to go past minor confrontations into a domain where only mastery exists. So let them watch. Let them plan. Allow them to misinterpret. You have already won the only game that counts, the one in which patience, vision, and calm control rewrite fate. You did not just feed them their own game. You created a whole new level of play, which is what makes you genuinely unstoppable. If this strikes you differently and you're ready to soar above the noise, don't simply watch. Be a part of this movement. Subscribe today to join a community focused on mastering the game rather than playing it mindlessly. Click the like button to express you're ready for more honest chat and raw truth. Leave a comment below. Share your tale, your struggle, and your breakthrough. Because this is more than just a channel, it's a community. Also, if you know anybody who is stranded in the mayhem, please share this with them. Let's work together to construct something unshakable. Your next level begins here. Do not miss it.